I begin with saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are. I'm very privileged to be invited to speak on behalf of or under the banner of multiple progressive organizations in the USA. The list was mentioned by Karthik. I don't remember them, but I would like to name each of them and thank them. But it's also important that you have organized a series of lectures on this particular topic, which is of very topical relevance, which the whole of India and now the whole world, thanks to anti-nationals like Rihanna and Greta Thunberg and others, the whole world is discussing it. And yesterday I realized Trevor Noah is also talking about it in his programs. This is something that the world is discussing, and it's just appropriate that you are organizing this talk on this topic today. Let me straight away get into the point, because I got into the format of the program. I speak for about 25 to 30 minutes as an introductory remark, and then we get into an interactive mode. So let me, in brief, say what I want to say. The Farm Acts that we are discussing today is basically a set of reforms that are brought about by the government with regard to certain provisions in agricultural marketing. Now, these provisions in agricultural marketing have been existent in India from the 1960s onwards, from the time of the so-called Green Revolution. Often it is assumed that Green Revolution was a technological package, but it is often not so well recognized that Green Revolution, the technological package of the Green Revolution, was also ably supported by a set of public institutional support structures, which included supports in price, supports in subsidy, supports in credit, supports in marketing, supports in agricultural research, and also supports in agricultural extension. So a whole paraphernalia of support structures in agriculture was created in order to incentivize farmers to adopt the new technology of Green Revolution and so on. It is part of this that I mentioned a series of interventions. Let me pick two out of them and start the discussion. The first was related to price policy, and the second was related to marketing policy. With regard to price policy, this was the time when the government began to implement what is called as a national food policy, whereby, thanks to Green Revolution, we had a few problems. One is that there were some surplus regions that had emerged, Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, and so on, and a large number of deficit regions in the south, in the east, northeast, etc. That was one problem that was created. Geographically, production became unequal. The second problem was indeed that the Green Revolution was not implemented by, was not something that was led by all the farmers of India. It was led by this. It was spearheaded by a set of farmers who were historically well endowed relative to others in these parts of India. That is Punjab, Haryana, Western Uttar Pradesh, etc. So you had to create some kind of a mechanism to A, transport the food grains from the surplus areas to the deficit regions. B, you also had to find a way by which the interests of the producers on the one hand are reconciled with the interest of consumers on the other hand. Producers wanted higher prices, consumers wanted lower prices. So you had to somehow reconcile this problem of contradictory expectations from the new system. So in order to ensure that both these are met, the national food policy was introduced, whereby the idea of support price, the idea of procurement price, etc., were introduced in Indian agriculture. The Food Corporation of India was established, which would actually go and procure food grains from farmers in these surplus regions based on a procurement price, and they will be distributed into the other parts of India, the deficit parts of India, through what is called as the ration shop system or the public distribution system. So this became a connected chain of connected supply chain, may I say, that was introduced to ensure food security at that time. The second part was, of course, the whole point about producers and consumers. There, what the government did was the government tried to ensure that the producers are given a remunerative price, while the consumers need not pay such a high price. They can pay a lower price through the PDS. And the difference between these two was to be met by the Government of India's budget as an item called food subsidy. So food subsidy would meet the difference between the costs of procuring food grains from the farmers and the distribution and what you get back from the system as price from the PDS. So the difference between these two, which is a cost which has to be met by someone, will be met by the government through the food subsidy item. So this was one important intervention, with regard to prices. Second important intervention was with respect to marketing. Here, prior to Green Revolution, farmers of India were largely selling their produce to village traders who came to the village and bought the produce. And these village traders never gave the farmers a good price. They always forged weights and measures. They never gave the accurate market information to the farmers. So there was a whole lot of exploitation going on in the chain of marketing where the farmers directly participated. Now, this was sought to be transformed with a new set of policies in agricultural marketing from the 1960s onwards, where states of India passed what are called as the APMC Acts, Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee Acts, whereby new regulated markets or mandis will be established in villages, which would mean that these are regulated mandis where market transactions take place in a very transparent form. So if you enter the regulated market, the price will be very clearly displayed there. On top of that, the farmer can actually participate in auctions of his produce to ensure that he gets the best price from the trader who is ready to give the best price. There are also standardizations of weights and measures. No forging is going on. There are also facilities for the farmer to stay in the regulated market and sell the next day if he thinks that the price will go up the next day. So all these facilities were opened up for the farmer as part of these regulated markets or mandis. So this became the second important intervention. So price related interventions with respect to procurement price, support price, Food Corporation of India, all these came on the one hand. On the other hand, the passing of APMC Acts at the state level and the establishment of mandis at the state level happened. So these two, apart from other interventions of that time, aided the package of Green Revolution immensely, helped India attain a condition of food grain self-sufficiency by the 1980s. Now, come to the 1990s, the liberalization agenda that is adopted in Indian agriculture begins to question this kind of a policy framework that was followed from the time of Green Revolution. It is argued by the proponents of liberalization that the policy of the food subsidy to meet the interests of both consumers and producers, as well as the procurement price system that was followed at that time, are actually expensive in terms of the fiscal, in terms of being a fiscal burden on the central government's budget. It's just because the food subsidy was growing, and this growing food subsidy was argued to be a burden on the Indian state's budget. So it was that was one point that was raised. The second point that was raised was that the government was an inefficient player in the food grain market. Private players are much more efficient, and they should be allowed to play a role in the food grain market. The third point that was raised was that because you have a procurement system, and because you have a procurement price and a support price and so on, you are actually discriminating against the farmer, because you are denying the farmer an opportunity to gain a higher price compared to the procurement price or the support price by either A, exporting the produce outside India, or B, selling it at a higher price in the domestic open market. Because you are actually denying the farmer a higher export price or a higher domestic market price by procuring it from the farmers at a relatively lower procurement price. The argument was made that it were actually harming the farmer more than helping the farmer. So because of these whole set of arguments made in favor of liberalization, the government began plans to actually reduce procurement of grains in the economy. There was a lot of debate about whether MSP system should be continued, whether the government should actually procure in an open-ended form or should have maximum limits set for procurement and so on. And also, if you procure less, you also require less to be distributed through the PDS. So PDS need not be open to everybody, be universal. It can actually be open to only those people who need it, the hungry, needy people. So the population was divided into what is called APL population and BPL population, above poverty line and below poverty line population. And only the below poverty line population gets food grains at subsidized prices. Above poverty line people do not get. So all these changes were brought about in the sphere of price policy from the 1990s onwards. Come to the marketing policy, the argument that was raised was, from the time of Green Revolution onwards, we are stuck into a rice-wheat complex and we are not diversifying our agricultural cropping pattern. And in order to diversify the cropping pattern, we should move into fruits, vegetables, flowers, etc., which are high value, which are export oriented, and which are capital intensive. But this diversification of the cropping pattern cannot be brought about by simply relying on the setup of small and marginal farmers and their predominance in the Indian agriculture. You need economies of scale on the ground, and only then there would be an effective and efficient shift of cropping pattern from rice, wheat, etc., to fruits, vegetables, flowers, etc. So if you don't want the predominance of small and marginal farmers, if you want economies of scale, what should you do? The proponents of liberalization said there are two ways to go about it. One is corporate farming, whereby you invite corporate companies to come and either buy or lease in the lands of small and marginal farmers, cultivate land directly, and adopt the most modern technologies there, achieve economies of scale thereby, and either export the produce directly from there or process it within the farm, whatever they want to do. The second, so this was for the first point, corporate farming. But corporate farming had some legal impediments. The legal impediments were that there are land reform laws in India and Indian states which set upper limits as to how much an individual or a household can own or operate. So it was argued that in order to bring in corporate farming, India should dilute its land reform laws. India should take away the land ceilings and allow people to hold as much land as they please. So that was one set of arguments raised. The other pathway that was advocated was not corporate farming, but contract farming, which is slightly different, where the company does not go and cultivate the land directly from the farmers. What it does is it basically signs a contract with the farmer that the farmer will supply a predetermined crop of a predetermined grade at a predetermined time at a predetermined price to the company at the time of harvesting. Right? So it is a contract. The company doesn't get into cultivation. The company only buys it from the farmer based on a particular contract as to what the quantity, price, grade, crops, etc. should be at the time of harvesting. Now, this was the other alternative that was suggested. But here again, there were legal impediments because there were these APMC Acts that were enacted in the 1960s. The APMC Acts had said that each market in India, each mandi in India will have a notified area around them. This notified area around them could be sometimes a taluka, sometimes a tehsil, sometimes the whole district, etc. But it means that in the notified area, all agricultural marketing activities will be under the supervision of this agricultural produce marketing committee, the Mandi committee. This would mean that any private market coming to operate in these notified areas would require an approval from the APMC market committee. Number two, if there are taxes to be paid at the APMC level, the private markets should actually be paying those Mandi taxes to the APMC market committees. If these two things are happening, then the APMC can allow. But it was subject to permission given by the APMC and subject to paying whatever taxes other traders pay in the APMC system. This was argued to be an impediment to the introduction of contract farming, and this law should be amended by states, it was argued, in order to bring in contract farming in Indian states. So this is the broad framework of argumentation, the advocacy for these policies that happened from the 1990s onwards. So given the need to amend APMC Acts, the central government sent a model act to the states, which can be used to amend their APMC legislations to allow for anyone wanting to open a private market, being able to open a private market in the notified area without permission from the APMC, without paying a mandi tax to the APMC. So anyone can come and open a market anywhere without any regulation, without payment of any taxes. That was advocated through a model act of the central government and sent to the states. But only some states passed some parts of it. Nobody passed it in toto anywhere in any state of India. Then what happened is from 2003 to 2017, there was some kind of a lull. And then in 2017 and 18, the government, what it does is that it takes up the 2003 Model Act, splits it into two separate acts, one with respect to APMC legislation only, and the other with respect to contract farming separately, and sends two more Model Acts to the states for passing in their legislative assemblies. Here again, some states do some parts of it, some states don't do a lot of other parts in the same legislation. So the evidence is mixed. This is the situation whereby when the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, the government used the opportunity to decide that we are not going to rely on the states anymore in the implementation of this policy. We are going to pass an ordinance at the central level itself, bypassing the states to enact these legislations. Now, this is the broad context of the ordinances that were brought about in May and June of 2020, and the farm acts that were passed in the parliament later in the month of September in 2020. Now, this is the overall context. Now, let us come into the acts and the legislations that were passed and why there is a farmer protest. The first point that I would like to make here is that these legislations are fundamentally unconstitutional. I say these are unconstitutional for a particular reason. If you look at India's constitution, it has very clearly laid out what is it that the central government can do, what is it that the state governments can do, and what is it that both can do together. So there is a central list, there is a state list, and there is a concurrent list where both can act. So if you look at interstate trade, central government can come in. It is allowed under entry 42 of the central list of the constitution. But if you come to state list of the constitution, entry 14 of the state list very clearly states that agriculture is a state subject. Right? All legislations related to agriculture have to be made at the state level. Now, this is not the only thing. Entry 14 is not the only entry in the state list. If you look at entry 26 in the state list, it refers to trade and commerce within the state. Entry 27 refers to production, supply, and distribution of goods. And entry 28 refers to markets and fairs. Right? So these are different entries in the state list that very clearly say marketing is a job of the state government. But then how did the central government pass these legislations? They used a little loophole that was available in the constitution, which was that entry 26, that is trade and commerce within the state, and entry 27, production, supply, and distribution of goods. These two entries were subject to what is called as entry 33 in the concurrent list. So if a very extreme circumstance comes in, the central government has a small space to get into the state's jurisdiction with respect to entry 26 and 27 to enact legislation. But this was enacted in 1954, this amendment, because at that time there was a problem of food shortage and so on. That is the context in which this legislation was introduced at that time. Entry 33 was introduced into the constitution at that time. But that is not to be used in a normal circumstance like we obtain today. But what the central government did was to use this opportunity to violate the federal principles of the Constitution, enter into the state's domain of jurisdictions, and enact the 3 Farm Acts. This is the point. Interestingly, it is important to note that entry 28, right, 26 and 27 are subject to entry 33 in the concurrent list, but entry 28, which is markets and fairs, is not subject to entry 33 in the concurrent list. So that is very important to understand, that markets and fairs are not subject to entry 33 in the concurrent list. So there are big problems in the way the central government has decided to enter into this domain and legislate. And a lot of states have approached the Supreme Court for redressal. And the Supreme Court, however, as is the Supreme Court of India, in many other cases as well, is simply sitting on these petitions without hearing them, without giving them a hearing. And the constitutionality question will come up soon in the Supreme Court. That is one point. The second is with respect to the content of these legislations. I'll make a few brief points and then we can have a discussion on the remaining points. The first is that I shall take a few arguments of the government and sort of check if they are appropriately made or not. The first argument that the government raises is that these acts are good because it will allow the farmers of India more freedom to sell. Let us check if this argument is correct or not. The first is to note here is that de facto, if you see, this freedom to sell to whoever they want to is already availed and available to the Indian farmer. Right? What do I mean by that? What I mean is that if you take a crop like paddy, about 29% of the paddy produced in India is sold by, only 29% of the paddy produced in India is sold by a farmer directly to a mandi. The rest is sold to a private trader in the village or an input dealer in the village, and so on and so forth. Right? If you take wheat, only 44% is sold by a farmer directly to a mandi. If you take maize, only 39% is sold by a farmer directly to a mandi. Right? This means that this freedom to sell is already available to the farmer. The rest is already sold outside the mandi to a trader who offers the farmer a good price. The question may arise, why is this the case? This is the case because A, there aren't enough mandis in India. The government has not established enough mandis in India. There should be at least 10,500 mandis in India, but there are only 6,800 mandis in India. So farmers don't have access to mandis nearby their villages, number one. Number two is that India is dominated by small and marginal farmers. And small and marginal farmers have small amounts of surplus. And the surplus is not adequate for them to bear the transport cost, take it to a mandi which is 25 to 30 kilometers away and sell at that mandi. Because the transport cost itself will be so huge that the whole process becomes unviable. As a result, in order to save the transport cost, the small and marginal farmer decides to sell it at the village level itself to a trader in the village. Right? So basically, if you see, the freedom that the government is talking about is already available to the Indian farmer. That is point number one. Right? Now, second is, what I just said was de facto. Now let's look at de jure. De jure in the sense, I said earlier that some parts of these model acts that were sent by the center were already passed by many of the states. Right? Now, if you look at those states, right, where these are not a small number of states, about 18 states have amended their APMC acts to allow for the establishment of private markets. About 19 states have amended their APMC acts to allow for direct purchase of agricultural produce from farmers. Right? About 13 states have amended their APMC acts to allow for farmers' markets or direct purchase of consumers of the farmers' produce. Such markets are already available. Right? So the question to ask is, given that many states have already done some of these legislations, it is appropriate to check whether private investment and private markets have come into those states or not. Right? Only then freedom will come. Right? So if you look at, say, Bihar, where the extreme step was undertaken, that is, the APMC Act was not amended, was just repealed in 2006. Mandis just closed down. Okay, in the expectation that private markets will come, no private market has come, no private investment has come. In fact, the farmers in Bihar have been pushed from a state of regulated mandis to completely unregulated and unscrupulous traders and their domination on the other. Right? So the MSP in India, the minimum support price in India, rules at 1,900 per quintal, rupees per quintal for paddy, but farmers in Bihar can get only 1,300 rupees per quintal. Right? They don't have markets, they don't receive a good price, and no private markets have been established. So what is the point that you're talking about? Where is the freedom that is going to come from? Right? So the question arises, why is it that private markets do not come? Right? The private markets are unlikely to come because of very high transaction costs in establishing agricultural markets in India. What do I mean by that? If you look at India, large number of small and marginal farmers, if a private market is opening at the ground level, at the village level, the private market will have to procure commodities from each and every small and marginal farmer in their very small amounts, right? And they have to grade them, they have to weigh them, they have to make a transaction with them, they have to store it, they have to transport it to the nearest urban market, they have to sell it in their retail outlet. Right? There are transport costs, there are storage costs, there are labor and loading and unloading costs. Right? All these costs add up to create a problem of high transaction costs for private players wanting to enter the agricultural marketing business. This is one reason why a lot of private firms, including, for example, Reliance Fresh, do not open rural collection centers or private markets, though they can legally. They, in fact, prefer to go to an APMC mandi and buy in large quantities from there because they can avoid the problem of high transaction costs. Right? In other words, it is highly unlikely that private markets will emerge in any significant number once these legislations are enacted. This would mean that the farmer would lose access to the mandis, because mandis will get weakened on the one hand, but private markets also do not come. So mandis become weakened and private markets don't come. That is one possibility. Okay, in such a case, you will be pushed from a Punjab-like situation to a Bihar-like situation, regulated markets to completely unregulated markets and the dominance of unscrupulous traders. Is that what you want? A system is working well in Punjab, Haryana, and so on. You want to destroy it and make it like Bihar, where farmers don't get a good price? That is one question that the farmers are raising. The second question is, if at all private markets come, let's assume that private markets will come. So mandis get weakened and private markets come. In such a circumstance, will the farmer get a good price? That question can be answered only if we look at whether the transaction costs that are going to be incurred by the private company when they come into establishing a private market will actually be higher than the existing mandi tax structure, which will go away if private markets come. So is the mandi tax structure more expensive, or is it the new transaction costs that will come for a private company that are more expensive? That would be more expensive. Studies show that it's very likely that the private transaction costs of companies are likely to be higher than the existing market structure with respect to mandi taxes. So the higher transaction cost will be transferred to the farmer as a lower price in that circumstance. So it's not a higher price the farmer is likely to receive, as the government claims, but a lower price, most probably, because of the predominance of transaction costs for the company. Third question, the government says we are going to eliminate all middlemen from the process. But will middlemen be eliminated? Here also it is unlikely because of the high transaction costs. The private companies would like to outsource the process of, even if they come, they would like to outsource the process of collecting or aggregating produce from a large number of small marginal farmers to a set of private traders or private guys. It is very likely that one middleman is going to be replaced by another middleman. No middleman is going to disappear. Right? As a result, this whole idea of we are removing the middleman is also a completely wrong argument made by the government. Right? Now, the other argument being usually made is that these mandi taxes are actually a wasteful expenditure. That is also not true, because mandi taxes are used by governments like Punjab and so on to construct and maintain rural roads, to run veterinary hospitals, to have rural toilets, rural sanitation facilities, and so on, which are which will be completely lost. That revenue will be completely lost if the mandi taxes go away. The other is that a lot of infrastructure creation in APMC markets, APMC mandis, is actually done using the revenues of mandi taxes that the mandis get. But now, who will invest in mandis? Who will invest in agricultural infrastructure if mandi taxes go away? This is a question that a lot of people are raising. Now, this is the problem with the first act. The second act is with respect to the contract farming legislation. The contract farming legislation here means that the contract farming is sometimes a good thing also, because the farmers sometimes like contract farming, because you have a problem of price risk at the time of harvesting, because everybody is harvesting at the same time. There may be a glut in the market. So if you have a contract with a company, that would mean that you know the price that you're going to get, and that's a positive thing for the farmer, okay, if all goes well. But that's not the end of the story. The story is also about companies breaching the contract sometimes. So the company signs a contract with the farmer to buy the produce at rupees 10 per kg at the time of harvesting. But at the time of harvesting, the market price falls to rupees 7 per kg. And the company prefers to go to the open market and buy it at 7 rupees per kg rather than incur a loss and buy it from the farmer at rupees 10 per kg. It breaches the contract. Theoretically, the farmer can go to a court, but we know that the legal battery of the firm will appear in the court and will convincingly argue that the quality of the produce that was supplied by the farmer was poor, and as a result they were forced to reject the produce because the farmer was actually breaching the contract because he did not sell a good quality product to us. And the farmer will be unable to prove it because he does not have the battery of lawyers or the legal team that the company would have. Right? So this is one reason why, despite such provisions available for legal redress, farmers do not benefit when breaches of contract by the companies take place. That is one big problem with contract farming. Right? So the question is, how do you disincentivize the company from breaching a contract? How do you stop the company from breaking a contract? So one suggestion that is often provided is, can the government, local government, the panchayat, etc., countersign as a third party in these agreements, so that if the company breaches the contract, it would also be breaching the contract against the government. So it would be a little hesitant to do that. The second is, can we not look at individual contracts, but group contracts, cooperatives, farmer producer companies, etc., groups of farmers engaging with companies, whereby again the company will be disincentivized from breaking the contract because it is not breaching the contract with one farmer but a group of farmers. Then it affects the future status of the company in the business. So it would be a little reluctant to breach contracts. So these are the ways in which you need to look at breach of contracts and the possible ways out. Does the proposed act of the government serve this purpose? Hardly. It does not have adequate provisions to prevent the breach of contracts by the company. Grievance redressal mechanisms are highly inadequate in the legislation that is provided. The second is that when contract farming comes, experience across the world tells us that there are a lot of food security considerations that come up. For example, the cropping pattern of a whole region changes to another crop thanks to contract farming. What happens as a result is that the local food security concerns become more important because food grains are shifted to other crops. So what happens to food security? That's another question that usually arises. The third question that has usually been raised in these debates is whether contract farming is always the intensive farming that is associated with contract farming. Is it always environmentally sustainable or not? Okay. Other questions are also raised. There is a lot of labor displacement that happens because of unbridled mechanization. There is an indiscriminate use of child labor or low-paid female labor to save on costs. All these are problems the world has seen with contract farming. So the question is, even though contract farming may be desirable in some instances, many instances, what we need is actually a good regulation of contract farming, which will prevent all the problems, which will disincentivize the companies from doing all these issues that I just mentioned. So we need a good regulation. That should be a law. But the criticism against this particular Farm Act of the government is it is not actually a regulation. It actually is a promotion. It's a promotional act, not a regulatory act. And that is one of the big problems that is being raised by farmers, that this law is actually aiming to promote, not regulate contract farming. And what we need is actually a good regulation of contract farming. Okay, so this is with regard to the second act. Now, the third act, I didn't speak about it earlier. I'll quickly mention it and I'll stop my comments. It is related to the amendment to the Essential Commodities Act of 1955. What the government is doing by this act is that it is basically removing all the stock limits that exist for traders, processors, exporters, etc. And it is simply removing them all. There's no stock limit anymore, which used to be there for the government to intervene if a company does black marketing, if a company does hoarding, and so on. If a trader does all this, there are provisions for the government to come in and stop all this. Now, the problem is that now, with the stock limits going away, none of those instruments of intervention will be available for governments. Okay. Number two is that this particular legislation has been brought up by the into the parliament by the government, saying that if the stock limits are removed, we can incentivize companies to private companies to come and invest in storage and warehousing. Okay, private companies are disincentivized to come and invest in storage and warehousing because there are stock limits in this Essential Commodities Act. They want to establish a huge silo, as in the United States, with huge capacities, but that capacity creation is limited by the stock limit provision, whereby a company cannot store or a trader cannot store beyond a particular quantity. If you remove that quantity, more private investment will come. Right? So the whole idea here is to allow the creation of large agri corporations to come in and create huge storage and warehousing facilities. For example, Adani Logistics Limited is a company which is getting ready to invest in this area. What Adani has done, Adani is already the largest port operator in India. Adani is already the largest airport operator in India. Right now, come backwards through the supply chain, the whole logistics chain. If you look at the logistics chain, you will see that Adani has already about 30 to 40% capacity or market share in integrated cold chain service providers of India. So he's a dominant player in the logistics sphere. And he's also having something like Reliance Fresh, which is called the Adani Agri Fresh on the retail side. So there are companies like this which are waiting for opportunities to come in. Tomorrow, if the Food Corporation of India's procurement stops, tomorrow, if the mandis disappear and all those commodities that are currently being handled by FCI or the mandis come into the open market, then these private companies in the logistics business will have a field day. And that is the aim, keeping in mind in which the companies are coming forward and investing huge amounts in this. So the problem here is that this will lead to a situation whereby large agribusiness corporations will have a huge hold over what is happening in agricultural trade. And this would mean that farmers are likely to be exploited further in terms of giving them a lower price and consumers being forced to pay a higher price. So this dominance of agribusiness corporations is one reason why there is a lot of resistance against the third legislation, which is the Essential Commodities Essential Commodities Amendment Act of 2020. So broadly, friends, this is the a summary set of points that I wanted to make with respect to why these three acts are being debated in India, why the farmers are agitating against these three farm acts. I have tried to be very brief, but I'm very happy to take some questions from you in the interactive mode if there are any clarifications or further points that you would like to hear from me. So I'll end here. I've exceeded by about 5 minutes. I'm very sorry, but thank you very much for this opportunity.